Welcome. Today I'm going to talk about how I became a maintainer and kind of the different steps that happened along the way and stories and how that has changed my perception. So who am I? I'm Bert Regeer. I'm a photographer, a tweeter, a blogger, and because I'm standing up here, I dabble a little in programming, just a little. What do? I am a team lead for a group of incredibly smart and talented individuals at Crunch.io. We're a small company doing columnar database. I actually work with Chris McDonough, Bob Brewer, and a whole bunch of other people in the Python community. So that's very exciting to me. For open source, it's a long list, but my primary project I work on is the Pylons project. We maintain Pyramid, Waitress, WebOb, Deform, WebTest, and a whole range of other web technologies that you all are probably familiar with. We're a collective of individuals working on those technologies, and we're looking for more people, so by all means, please join us in developing these technologies and working alongside that. So, as a collective, everyone here as developers, rely heavily on many different open source projects. So once you install, pip install a project, you pull down hundreds of other projects alongside it. If you do yarn install or npm install, if you're doing JavaScript, the same thing. You pull down all of these other dependencies, and not all of them are as well maintained or as well, have as big of a community behind them as the Plone community does. So a lot of people think that open source is actually maintained like this, that you have, groups of people coming together, and Plone kind of works like this, right? Like, you guys have sprints where you get together and you actually work on stuff, but many, many other projects don't work like this. Instead, they look a lot more like this. Just one more ticket before going to bed. Just one more ticket to finish, and then I'm gonna go push this release. So I'd like to thank Commit Strips for this comic. Definitely go check them out. They have fantastic comics related to being a developer. So definitely something to check out. But generally, there's that one dedicated person that keeps the project moving forward. There's that one person that is pushing the commits, that's checking the code reviews, that's pushing to the latest master and testing it. But eventually, the love runs out. It becomes unsustainable. It becomes impossible to continue loving a project over long periods of time if you don't have help, if you don't have anyone that is there to kind of push you. You are moving on to other languages and tools. You start working on at a different company. You no longer use the project that you've been developing. So it now becomes more of a chore than a love to continue it. So you can help. That's the big thing. You can triage bugs. You can link tickets that are related. You can fix bugs and submit PRs. And you can write documentation or tutorials. But this is where you, as a user of the library, can go help out and make sure that this doesn't happen, that it's no longer a chore by helping out with the little bits and pieces that help make a project great. But the biggest thing is you can help by becoming a maintainer. If a project no longer has love, if it doesn't have someone that's willing to push it, and you can clearly see that they're burnt out, you can step up and say, hey, I would love to become that maintainer. Become that champion. Become that person that's like, one more ticket before I go to bed. So a little story. This is how I became a maintainer. It started when I joined the Pylons project a couple years ago. I started by joining IRC, submitting a bunch of patches and stuff like that. And eventually I was given the commit bit on the WebOb GitHub repository, and as a maintainer on PyPy. Just scary. So let's take a step back. What is WebOb? WebOb is an open source library that wraps the WSGI Python request response pipeline and allows you to very easily manipulate HTTP requests and responses. It was started by Ian Bicking, who's known for Paste, WebTest, pip, virtualenv, and a whole range of other projects. And he stepped back and away from the Python projects when he moved to, I believe, Mozilla and started working on Rust projects, which is, as I mentioned, one of the ways that people tend to move away from their projects. It becomes a chore, they no longer want to work on it. It was taken over by the Pylons project and kind of given into their care to deal with. There was another maintainer, Sergey, that kind of took over after that and started working on it. So he uses it. WebOb's used by a couple different frameworks. Pylon's the predecessor to Pyramid. Pyramid, of course, as I just mentioned. A variety of other smaller frameworks use it as well. Google App Engine, WebApp 2, Bobo, MorePath, Beacon, and OpenStack uses it. If you've ever visited Reddit, Yelp, SurveyMonkey, Roadcode, or used some of Mozilla services, your HTTP request has gone through a pipeline that has included WebOb. The new PyPy, for example, is based on Pyramid, and thus someday soon, once it's released, which we'll never know when that is, it too will use WebOb. So it's an important library. So what's the code status? WebOb has organically grown over the years. The code has changed to handle newer HTTP headers to meet new and changing standards, and I'm its third permanent maintainer. Coding styles are very different between all of us maintainers, though. Ian Bicking's style is very different from Sergey's style, and it's very different from my style. So I got started in WebOb because I'm a detail-oriented guy. WebOb, based upon HTTP standards, is based upon RFCs, and RFCs are very subjective. They're written by humans in English, which means that they can be interpreted many different ways. The way I started was I became a regular in RFC and started arguing for or against changes based upon those RFCs in the way that they were interpreted by both browsers and other implementers of the HTTP standard. This is what allowed me to slowly provide patches and become involved with the project. Before I know it, the following rolls by on my terminal in my IRC client. Make X58 a committer and throw this shit at him, as said by radio. He seems insane enough for the task. Thanks, Michael. 3 minutes later, this appears. X58, you now have commit access to WebOb. My advice, find a blanket. I never did find a good blanket. I think that's my only regret so far. That's by Chris McDonough, who some of you probably know or know well. So at this point, I was a maintainer. And don't mess it up is the big thing I was told over time, like, don't mess it up. I just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and bam, there I suddenly had a bunch of extra responsibilities. Yeah, maybe the right place, right time. I don't know. The WebOb was pretty special in that there was no existing maintainer at the time. It had been handed over to the Pylons project to maintain and to deal with. However, there was no existing person I could go to for advice on how would you handle this. There was no existing person because they had all stepped back. It was being handled by a collective of people that just didn't have a lot of interest in the nitty-gritty details, which made it difficult to go through and understand, okay, what if this change happens, or what if this change happens, how does that get handled? So I want to sidetrack just a little bit and go back to imposter syndrome. Yesterday was a great talk by, I don't remember the guy's name, about debugging yourself. Look it up. I would highly recommend watching that video. It was a fantastic talk. But he went over imposter syndrome, and it's something that I believe many of us in the community have, where we don't feel like we're good enough, that we're not good enough to take over a project, that we're not good enough to be able to do this, that we're not good enough to be where we are. And it's just the brain lying to us, making our failures seem much larger and our successes seem much smaller. You are good enough. You are definitely good enough. In most cases, you likely won't be given GitHub access and PyPy access and everything else all at the same time. You're going to get those over time. There's going to come a time where you've been submitting patches, you've been triaging bugs and things of that nature, and you've been reviewing things, that someone's going to go, hey, why don't I just give you that commit bit on GitHub? And now you can press that big green button that says commit to master or merge to master. That's where it starts. It's slowly over time. It's not likely you're going to get it right off the bat, but it's working towards that. And you are good enough. So when that opportunity comes, don't say, no, please don't give me that. I don't feel like I have that responsibility, like I can take on that responsibility and make that a success. You are good enough. You can make that a success, and you will make it a success. After all, what's the worst that can happen? What's the absolute worst? You push a bad, version, you delete it from PyPy, and the world continues to run. So back to where we were. It's all mine. That's right, the project's all mine. I can do with it as I please. I have the power. I had all these great ideas. I got access to WebOb. I had these ideas before, but I wasn't really going to act upon them. But now I had all these great ideas. I wanted to fix things. I wanted to replace it. I wanted to make it better than ever before, and people would love me for it. So I started ripping out the old code. It's like moving into a new house. You want to get rid of the old color on the wall. You want to remove the carpet, or deep clean it in most cases. You just want to dive in, rip out those various decrepit APIs, and remove that code for supporting IE6 on Windows XP, because let's be honest, who still runs Windows XP? You have all these good intentions, so you slowly clean up the code. You feel like you finally have a nice, clean API. Everything feels great, and everything's looking up. You've pushed a couple of alphas and betas, and everything still seems to be okay. You haven't heard any complaints. You do some simple smoke tests with projects you know use your library, and nothing seems broken. So you push a new version to PyPy and send out an email saying, hey, I've released this, post a post on Twitter, and off you go. You think everything is fine with the world. Not even 24 hours later, you get an email from GitHub saying, letting you know there's a new issue. The title, latest change breaks X and Y, where Y is a well-known open source project that relies heavily on your project. In my case, that was WebOb 1.5 breaks something in OpenStack. I had removed functionality that the Glance project in OpenStack was using. I thought it was a good idea to remove it, and ultimately I pushed back against the project and told them, no, you are using it wrong. But I had broken someone else's code, not realizing that they were using it. Wait, what did I break? When you're making your changes, you have no idea that little used feature, likely undocumented, most likely nothing that's ever been tested before or properly, is being used by a downstream consumer because they had read the source code and figured out this was the way that they could do their thing and make their thing work. So it's time to take a step back. Yes, you are the new maintainer, and yes, it's now your project to do with as you please. However, if it's a well-loved project, like WebOb is, it is likely used by many people around the world in ways you can't imagine. Code growth is organic. It happens over time. There's those little warts, there's those little pieces of code that were added because they fix a bug for someone that's a consumer of your project. You might not realize it at the time, but that bug made a real-world concern or issue go away for someone that's a downstream consumer. It lets their code work. It lets them make money. So while it all looks a little innocent, and it looks like you could just remove it, especially if it's not documented, right? Because if it's not documented, it's not API. Now you've broken someone else. So the question is backwards compatibility. How much backwards compatibility do you as a maintainer maintain in this library that you are now maintaining? That's a lot it maintains. So there's different ways of thinking about this. In a library like WebOb, it's very different than a tool like pip or virtualenv. With pip or virtualenv for command line tools, you have a command line interface, and that is your API. The command line arguments are your API. In WebOb, which is a library, you have your functions and your classes. And while your functions and classes are your API, generally the internals, while no one should be touching them, can be touched. With the command line arguments, if you refactor the code, no one's using it directly. No one cares about the internals as long as the outside still does exactly what you expect it to do. In the library, if you make changes on the internals, it's entirely possible that someone, somewhere, read the code and was like, hey, I need this particular thing, and pulls it out, using it as a side effect. So this is where the question of policies comes in. Are there existing policies in the project that you took over regarding deprecation and how you remove functionality? Is there a requirement for APIs to be fully documented for them to be public and thus be allowed to be used by downstream consumers? Has this been documented for a long time? If you don't have those policies, start building them. You need to start building them and understand how this is going to affect not just you and your users, but also in the long run in terms of how many versions you're going to support. How many versions of this library are you going to support over time? In the Pylons project, we have a support policy of the current version plus one version lower. And we have a deprecation policy of 2 versions. So if it gets deprecated, and then 2 versions later it's gone. We have that policy and we have that set so that our consumers know that if something is going to be deprecated, it's going to be gone in 2 versions, giving them time to migrate to the newer API that we've developed. The question is, can you afford to lose your users? If you've just become the maintainer, can you afford to just roughshed run across the code and lose your users and potentially cause a fork? The older code is still there. It still exists on GitHub. Someone's probably got a clone of it somewhere. They can push that back up. They can fork it, and they can start running with that version. Are you prepared for that? Are you prepared to lose potential people within the community and potential contributions because you decided that your way is better? So this is when the table flip happens, right? You have all these great ideas and you feel like you're tied to this boat anchor. You can't do anything. You're afraid to make changes because you're afraid to break people. This is where a big topic comes in, testing. If you have a full test suite with 100% coverage, it becomes easier to understand how the code's being used. It becomes easier to understand how your changes are going to break something, because hopefully when you make that change, a test breaks. Or a test has information that you can look up in the Git history to understand why it was added. Why was that change made in the first place? And in some cases, you can find that tests are testing the wrong thing and fix it to be correct. Look at the Git history and understand that maybe a bug had crept in, a regression. Add more testing. Once you have more testing, it becomes simpler to make sure that those regressions don't continue to happen. So it's time to rethink. Instead of outright removal of APIs or outright cleaning up the code and removing things, refactor the old APIs into using the new APIs that you're providing. If you can provide backwards compatibility in a simple manner by having the old code to call your new code, you now have the ability to maintain just the new code with the new API and slowly ask people to migrate to your new code. This allows you to use the old functions as little shims that just call the new code. Breaking changes are going to happen. It's a fact of life. There's going to be times when you have to make a breaking change for the good of everyone. In WebOb, this was the case recently where we had cookies that were being sent that were not valid according to the specification. I made changes. It still has full deprecation policy associated with it, and I still haven't released a new version that actually removes that. But it's now warning users about it. It's now going to be more correct. And that's a breaking change. It has broken people by having a deprecation warning show up. It has broken people when they run it in the fully standardized version. But it's a requirement to move things forward, to make things better, to actually improve upon the code base. You have to sometimes say, yes, this is a breaking change. But once again, use your deprecation policies. There's always a nuclear option, right? Rewrite. You can rewrite the entire library from scratch if you're not happy with it. Most likely, you'll have to maintain 2 separate versions, though. You're going to end up having to maintain more code, you're going to have more bugs, and because you rewrite it from scratch, all those little fixes, all those little warts are not actually going to be in the new code. So you're going to break users again. Jill Spolsky said the single worst strategic mistake, they decided to rewrite the code from scratch. And in this case, he's talking about Netscape 6. Netscape decided in their infinite wisdom, instead of refactoring their existing code base, that they should rewrite it from scratch. This, of course, meant that it took way longer and delayed the product release by so long that Internet Explorer had a chance to really move in and take over where Netscape once used to be. It's definitely viable, it's definitely an option, but it's not one I'd recommend. It's much easier to refactor code and make sure it takes longer, but it means that your users continue to use the library and can migrate along with you. So what's next? You've had your first bug due to making a huge change without necessarily knowing just how people are using your project. You've implemented policies around deprecation, and you're slowly refactoring while considering backwards compatibility. Well, you are now the gatekeeper of the project. You have to uphold not just the standards set forth by the previous maintainer or maintainers, because it could potentially be multiple, but set the bar higher by continuing to improve the code base. You are just a temporary guardian. Eventually there's going to come a day where someone else has to take over. One of the first keynotes here at PloneConf was where they were talking about the cycles of people joining the project. That's exactly what it is. You're just a temporary guardian. You should start looking at mentoring opportunities to find new people that could potentially start taking over, bring new people into the community, and worry about, what happens if you win the lottery and you decide to go sail around the Bahamas. So community, as I mentioned, is important. You need to find ways to engage them. Just because you're a maintainer, continue to submit pull requests. Yes, it means a little extra work for you. Don't just push to master. The reason for this is that you want to be able to get outside people to take a look at the code that you're writing and get feedback. This will let you engage the community in another way, which is that they now understand more of the code. Your users as well. If you're fixing a bug for someone, make sure to get the person that reported the bug involved in reviewing the code to verify that it now unbreaks whatever issue they had. This allows you to grow the code base, but also allow them to start feeling like they're comfortable enough to potentially contribute back. This is not as easy as it sounds. I will fully admit that with WebOb, I have not succeeded as much as I'd wanted there. I have a couple people that are involved on the side, but it's not as big as I'd want. And it's very difficult. It is very difficult to do that community outreach. It's very difficult to help get people involved in your project. It's difficult to get them engaged and interested because to them it's just a small part of the piece of the puzzle. It's something that they use. It's underlying. It's core. They don't really care about that. They want to build a new shiny Facebook. They want to build a new shiny Twitter. So outreach. Are your users open source projects or are they companies? With open source projects, you tend to use other open source projects. Be involved in their communities. I made an effort to reach out to the OpenStack community and other communities that are using WebOb in an attempt to make sure that I can help guide how they're using my library. So when I start deprecating things, I can help them make decisions on how they want to continue on, how they can change their use of my library to make things better. How can I help them so that I don't get those bug reports that I just broke them, but instead they get an easy report from me saying, hey, I'm making a change here. Could you guys take a look at potentially changing this in your code? This can be very helpful. Once you have that outreach, you have the ability to go get more feedback from people. You see how they use your code. You see how they build on top of it and what's important to them. So now I want to talk a little bit about myself. I want to talk about my change of perspective and how things around that have evolved as I've become a maintainer. The biggest thing is that just accept this pull request. Just do this. Just this fix. Just push a new version. Just is this word that makes it seem so simple. I still use it all the time, but it's very difficult. It's not as easy. It's not just accept a pull request. It's not just push a new version. There's a lot of cognitive overhead and thought that goes into accepting a pull request. You need to be able to look at the pull request, understand how your users are going to see it, understand how they're going to build on top of whatever this pull request is, and figure out if it actually fixes the issue it was meant to fix. In some cases, it doesn't. You get a pull request, oh, this worked for me. Well, yes, but the test clearly is failing, so it doesn't work. And does it have testing? That's where policies once again comes in. The Pylons project has a very clear policy. If it pull request does not meet 100% code coverage, then we don't accept it. But it's an easy, low bar that we've set because we don't want to spend time reviewing a bunch of patches in code that doesn't have 100% test coverage. It makes it very easy to filter those out and makes it easier on yourself as a maintainer, but also for users of your library or people that are submitting patches to just add a test. If it's so easy, why didn't they do it? It allows you to push back and allows you to tell your users and people submitting patches, hey, I have certain standards. I have certain requirements before I will accept this. Understanding code is hard. It's difficult. As you are now a new maintainer, you've taken over this existing project, you have to understand not just what the original creator of the project was thinking. You have to understand not just the existing code base, but when you get a pull request, you have to understand that code. You have to understand what that person was thinking when they wrote it. You have to understand the test. You have to understand how it all fits in with your existing project and how it's going to affect your users of the project. How does it affect the public API that you've made available? How does it affect the documentation? How does it affect all of these big different things? And how does it come together? It's not as simple. You have to have it takes a long time to flip from one project to another. You have to be able to focus and get within this whole mindset of how this is going to work. It's not as simple. The big thing for me is I've been writing better bug reports. I've been writing better bug reports because I know what it's like to get that drive-by. It doesn't work. What doesn't work? I have no further information. I don't know what doesn't work. Your terminal output doesn't mean anything to me. Yeah, I see a stack trace. It happens to have WebOb in it, but it doesn't mean anything to me. I don't know what your code is doing. But because of that, I've started writing better bug reports. I used to be frustrated, and I used to leave those drive-by comments too. But now I actually take the effort to understand the issue. I take the effort to see about where the potential code changes could be. I take the time to push myself to become better and to do better bug reports and potentially even fix the issue if I can. It's open source after all, and we could all use a little extra help making sure that our code gets better, that our project gets better, that we continue to evolve as a community. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm sorry it's a little shorter than expected.
Thank you, Bert. We'll have this open for questions. Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah, Tim or Kim.
Thanks, Bert. Could you tell us how it is that you slowly got involved more and more and to end up doing this? Like, how were you using WebOb?
I was using WebOb through the Pyramid project. So I started building Pyramid web applications, and I noticed there was deficiencies and APIs missing that I really wanted to have, specifically around cookie handling, actually. So I dove into Pyramid and I added a bunch of code, and Chris McDonough at one point said, hey, this feels like it should belong in WebOb. Can you refactor this and put it in WebOb instead? So that's when I started looking at the WebOb code. I started looking at the code base, and I found a couple of issues where hey, this can be fixed, or this is, something that I noticed was wrong. It wasn't so much that I dove into it expecting to become a maintainer. I dove into it to fix little nagging issues, or this, it's returning output that's not correct according to the RFCs. It's causing this issue in this browser and this issue in another browser because it's not standardized. So I dove into that, and it became bigger and bigger each time. My patches became bigger, and they would become longer. And then Chris McDonough and Michael America would both be like, nope, we're not going to review that. Like, it's too long. Like, I don't have the time right now. So it lingers longer and longer and longer. And that's when the comment came by from radio, like, hey, he's insane enough. Why not give it to him? So that was my build up to it. I've been using Pyramid for couple years. When I initially started using it, I thought it was too difficult and too big. It made me make too many decisions, and now I absolutely love it. And I'm a core contributor to Pyramid and the Pylons project. So I maintain a bunch of different projects now, actually. I maintain Waitress, which is a Python HTTP server, pure Python. I maintain parts of the rest of the stack, so Peppercorn, and a bunch of other projects around that. Dform is now being maintained by Miko, But yeah, there's been a bunch of projects that kind of don't have a maintainer, and as part of the Pylons project, I've kind of taken over and made sure that they have someone to at least shepherd through, pull requests and stuff like that. So, hope that answers that.
Other questions? I have a couple of comments and wanted to ask you to give some more input on community building in general. For example, this summer was the Google Summer of Code, and we're talking about how do we bring new people into our projects, and this was one opportunity for mentoring. I was just wondering if you could just touch on that experience.
Sure. Yeah, this year we had a Google Summer of Code that the Pylons project took a part of through the PSF. So we're grateful for the PSF for helping sponsor that. And we had a student that worked on WebOb actually, and it was very fulfilling to work with the student and mentor him throughout the program to help build on top of WebOb. He fixed a bunch of the MIME and accept handling, MIME type handling and accept handling that WebOb does. So hopefully that makes things better for everyone. But it was community building there is very important. So like Google Summer of Code is a great way to get new people new blood into your project. You get to post like, hey, these are some of the projects that can happen within a 3-month time period. And that's a great way of getting new people in. If you have those low-hanging fruits, if you have tickets on your issue tracker that are tagged with a tag that says, okay, here's something that can easily be done or sprintable. Another way, of course, is outside of Google Summer Code is sprints. We'll be here on Saturday and Sunday, or Steve will be at least, to sprint on Pyramid, and I know there's a couple of you out there that will be helping out with that too. But those are community building events. Google Summer of Code was fantastic because it allowed us to get someone that was completely unfamiliar with the code base and get them up to speed and work on this very complex, challenging aspect of it. There was a lot of discussions back and forth, and a lot of good information came out of that, which is helpful not just to WebOb, but also to the greater HTTP community about how to handle accept handling for languages and what the right ordering is and how you do negotiation around that, which was absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I'd like to extend on that too. It's like, with new people, we found that there are some barriers to entry. Someone who was not familiar with using GitHub or making commits frequently and he had that imposter syndrome. He wanted his code to be perfect before it could be reviewed. And that has a plus and a minus. We appreciated that he cared so much about the quality of his code, yet he was bringing more stress upon himself and more pressure upon himself to meet deadlines. So with that mentoring, we're able to manage and get him to the point where he was making commits more frequently, and we were able to give feedback to him.
And that's another big thing is if you're a user of an open source project, and you have ideas of how to change it, opening up that pull request is free. Yeah. Pushing new commits to it is free. Getting code review is free. That's the easiest way for me to look at something, and if you're willing to iterate on it, it's going to take a couple days or potentially a week to iterate over it and get it to a point where I'd feel comfortable with accepting it. That's one easy way to build and add to a project, to help a project along. Along with triaging and linking bugs and writing documentation, submitting patches is, of course, the biggest thing. Make sure to follow the policies of the project. Make sure to follow, if they have a deprecation policy and you're deprecating something, make sure you mark it as such. Make sure you document new APIs. Make sure you have full testing. But if you're willing to iterate on top of that and you're willing to work with the developer or maintainer of that project, it can be very fulfilling to get that patch accepted. That was my first experience with the Pylons project when I first got that first patch accepted, which was actually ripping out a bunch of lines of code, which I'm pretty proud of. It felt great. Like there's a sudden rush of, oh, my code was accepted, I'm doing something right.
There was also one other thing I wanted to remark on, is that within the Pylons project, I have just noticed that even when you make an issue or create an issue that is stupid, it really is stupid, I find that the people from within this project are, they don't say you're an idiot. They ask, why would you do that? Or give me more information. And try to get their perspective. So by that kind of a process, you happen to find out sometimes that they do have a valid point, even though they didn't really express it clearly. And, but sometimes, yeah, there are some really dumb ones, and you just roll your eyes and say, okay, but thank you for your contribution.
So the big thing there, biggest question I think has helped me a lot is, what are you trying to accomplish? When someone posts an issue or has a bug report, what are you trying to accomplish? Because answering that question can sometimes get you a better idea of how they're trying to use your library and potentially allow you to provide solutions to them, while at the same time understanding how the APIs or documentation is insufficient. It allows you to build on top of that and make changes that are for the good of the community.
My final remark would be that one other excellent thing that both the Plone Foundation and Pylons Project do really well is to document the policies and procedures. That is really important to the success of any project and any package. So if you need to find something to say, well, how do we accept pull requests? How do we build our documentation? How do we accept changes to our core code? Put that in writing so that you can just refer to it and share it with potential contributors. Are there other questions or comments that people would like to have? All right, thank you very, oh, go ahead, Bert.
This is the part where you contribute back and help make things better for me. So yeah, you can find me on Twitter. Once again, thank you very, very much. This was my first time speaking, so thank you very much, PloneConf, for the hearty welcome.